Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. My name is Ethan, and today we will be reacting to episode 2 of the Extra History Japanese Militarism series. This episode is called the Taisho Democracy. We ended the last one off on a very suspenseful note, so I'm excited to get started on this one. So, let's get into it.
Yokohama, September 1st, 1923. A city of liberal ideas, like labor unions, women's rights, and democracy. A city that smells of foreign delights, like chocolate
Very
and cigars.
Western
a
city.
About to be destroyed.
Uh-oh.
The ground shakes for 14 seconds, and in that time, most of the Western concrete buildings collapse, crushing hundreds. And though most traditional buildings are wood, soon fire rages through the city. Dazed survivors stagger around, coated in white dust. But it's not over. A 40-foot
no.
tsunami smashes into the coast. Ships are washed down streets and deposited on roofs. Then another wave follows, and another. The sea drowns or sweeps away thousands. Within minutes, Yokohama lays in almost total ruin, and the destruction continues inland to a place only 17 miles from the port city, Tokyo.
Yeah, I mean, there are many benefits to being an island nation, but the tsunamis that come with earthquakes are certainly not one of them. Immensely destructive, and it seems like this city was almost completely ruined by this natural disaster.
Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping us share today's historical tale. The destruction rages on. In Tokyo, a city still made largely of wood and rice paper, buildings ignite into district-wide infernos. Fire brigades try to respond, but the tremors have broken all the pipes. In an apocalyptic scene, residents evacuate to a clear area beside a river, but the city around them is a firestorm, and the rising heat combines with the high winds to create a fire whirl the size of a tornado.
Jeez.
Of the 140,000 killed, this one freakish accident will account for around 40,000 of them.
Oh my
And for a certain
goodness.
segment of the Japanese right wing, this was divine retribution for Japan flirting with Western ideas, allowing socialists and anarchists to operate and sabotaging the military's achievement.
I mean, absolutely insane. One, the amount of deaths that whole crisis caused, and two, the amount of deaths that one fire tornado caused. It's also, unsurprising that the ultra-nationalists and right-wingers would see this as some sort of divine retribution. I mean, this is a common theme throughout history. A horrific event happens, people think, well, this is God doing this. He's punishing us for something. I mean, it reminds me of the Lisbon earthquake of the late 1700s, I believe 1760s maybe, where there was a massive earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, and almost the entire city was destroyed, reduced to rubble, and around that time you have a lot of people saying, this is retribution, this is God's punishment. So, I mean, this is a very common theme that's happened for, throughout history.
Achievements abroad, in Korea and China. In fact, in the aftermath of the earthquake, mobs hunted and murdered Koreans and anarchists in retribution for the destruction. Now, that might sound strange, but
Scapegoating.
ultranationalist groups had been active in Japan for decades, including some who practiced paramilitary or intelligence activities. Two of the most prominent, the Black Ocean Society and the Black Dragon Society, were especially concerned with countering the threat from neighboring Russia and China. A decade earlier, they had entertained a more pan-Asian view, encouraging and sheltering Sun Yat-sen in the 1911 Chinese Revolution, but they increasingly saw Japan not just as the natural leader of the Asian nations, but its colonial master. And those who believed that military expansion was the key to national and economic security were known as militarists.
Yeah, this idea, as the title of the series might suggest, is going to expand quite considerably. The idea that they evolved from a pan-Asianism of sort of we, all as Asian nations, need to come together, to a different sort of pan-Asianism, which still wants Asia to come together, but come together under Japan. These guys will see Japan as the leader of all of Asia, basically.
But in the early 1920s, they were an extreme fringe, and there was no ultranationalist or militarist party in the Diet. Between 1912 and 1927, Japan entered a period of reform known as the Taisho Democracy, named after the ruling emperor. And part of that opening of society involved the rise of political parties. Now, there were a lot of parties, but we're going to focus on two today. the Conservative Sayukai, or Association of Friends of Constitutional Government, and the Liberal Kensekai, or Constitutional Politics Association. You actually met the Sayukai last episode. It was the party of Hara Takashi, the prime minister assassinated in a Tokyo train station. They claimed to be liberal, but were really more of a center-right bureaucratic party, believing in big government, large public spending, and opposing social reform programs. They also flirted with the militarist and ultranationalist right, positioning themselves as pro-military and largely in favor of colonialist projects. The Kensekai, by contrast, was a center-left party who backed labor unions, supported economic reforms for farmers, and stood against the rule of oligarchs. Their biggest policy proposal was universal male suffrage. But they'd also been kept out of power by oligarch machinations, prevented from forming a government even when they won the majority. And because the conservative Sayukai held the majority from 1900 until just after Hara's assassination in 1921, you'd think the ultranationalists would be happy. Well, not so much. For these men, the moderate conservatives were almost as despised as the leftists.
Yeah.
See, before Hara, the prime minister was usually a retired general or admiral and extremely friendly to the military. Ultranationalists also hated how Japan had joined the League of Nations after World War I. They thought it was a policy that did nothing but restrain Japan from acting decisively and unilaterally in its own interest. They argued.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that goes. Japan's membership in the League of Nations. Don't worry about that. That's going to be gone after, not too long.
That Hara hadn't even gotten the Paris Peace Conference signatories to affirm a statement of racial equality among the members. The UK and US shot it down. For a period,
of course
the
they did.
ultranationalists got excited at the prospect of the Siberian intervention, when Japan joined a multinational force attempting to stabilize the Russian Civil War. The army had hoped to keep Siberia, fashioning it into a buffer state against Russia. But Hara shot that plan down. And when he brought Japanese forces home, the military's perspective was that it wasted 5,000 men without gaining anything. But even after Hara's assassination by an ultranationalist sympathizer, he left them with one final indignity. He'd already dispatched a representative to the Washington Naval Conference. In an agreement meant to stop a naval arms race, Japan agreed to limit its navy to a size that Japanese admirals considered insufficient to defend Japan.
Yeah, one of the many initiatives taken after World War I to try and prevent future war and conflict. So this was an attempt to limit the navies of the world from, rapid expansion. Some other efforts similarly were taken. I mean, the League of Nations is the most prominent of these measures. That was an attempt to bring everybody together and have them negotiate peacefully instead of going to war. As might be suggested by the fact that we had a World War II, these measures they basically ended up being extremely ineffective. It may have been hard to tell at the time, but, as we draw closer and closer to World War II, a lot of these treaties and deals and negotiations will end up being cast aside in favor of the rising fascism and militarism of countries like, Germany, Italy, and Japan.
And its colonies. Sure, it was true that China was so divided by warlords at the time, it couldn't mount a naval threat. But the United States had several colonies and naval bases in the Central and Western Pacific. Though that wasn't their biggest worry. It was actually Soviet Russia that scared the ultranationalists most. It was big, powerful, and in one place, only 28 miles from the Japanese home islands. Plus, Russia posed an ideological threat. While Japan had already suppressed the Japanese Communist Party and driven it underground around the turn of the century, ultranationalists always feared it would rise again, especially after 1923, when a communism-influenced student tried to assassinate Crown Prince Hirohito. Revolution, it seemed, was in the air. In 1918, riots over the price of rice had exploded across the country, leading to popular violence, labor strikes, and even the bombing of police stations. Plus, the Siberian intervention made things worse, as the government bought stocks of rice to supply its troops. And then, in 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake wrecked both Yokohama and Tokyo. This necessitated a massive rebuilding effort that sucked up government funds, while meanwhile, inflation was squeezing the earth.
Yeah, a classic series of crises. A situation like this will often lead to increased radicalism, one way or the other. And it seems like this series of crises certainly did not help the situation.
Urban class. And that economic difficulty, and the dissent it caused, helped promote liberal opposition parties like the Kensekai, which won enough seats in 1924 to create a hung parliament and a three-party ruling coalition with the Sayukai. But given how much they had to compromise, the Kensekai's reform plan had to stay moderate. They passed universal male suffrage in 1925, hoping to move the country away from the oligarchs, and passed some economic bills. Yet under pressure from their allies, that same year, they also passed the Public Security Prevention Law. This allowed the government to jail anyone for 10 years if they formed or joined an association aimed to alter the Kokutai, the national body with the emperor at its head, or act against private property. Now, it was clearly aimed at communists and socialists, but considering its vague language, could come to be used on anyone. But while they had to compromise in the Diet, the Kensekai could push a more liberal platform in foreign relations. As foreign minister, the liberal Kijuro Shidehara defined Japanese diplomacy in the 1920s, pursuing amicable relations with Britain and the United States, and non-intervention in China. When trouble occurred, he usually evacuated Japanese citizens rather than sending troops. Even as Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, who the ultra-nationalists considered a Russian puppet, consolidated control in China, Shidehara stayed out of it. He refused to join with allied nations in threatening retaliation when Chiang's forces attacked several embassies. But Shidehara's hesitation to use troops, and the government cutting the army by 4 divisions, angered both the military and the public.
Yeah, I can very much see how that would make people angry. You know, the reluctance to use military force in any situation. You know, not saying it's bad or good, but you can definitely see how that would enrage a lot of people, especially nationalistic people.
Some ultranationalist and junior military officers even started to go as far as saying parliamentary government was un-Japanese. And then, financial panic hit. After the Great Kanto earthquake, the government had offered earthquake bonds to the big banks at a massively discounted rate. The idea being they could lend money to help with the rebuilding. But then by 1927, Japan was in an economic slowdown, and the government floated, making those bonds come due. The result was financial crisis. Citizens made a run on banks, withdrawing their money. Smaller banks collapsed overnight, leaving the market controlled by the big Zaibatsu corporations, many of which had political or family links to members of the Kensekai. Shidehara, for example, was married to a daughter of the man who founded Mitsubishi. It was not a good look, and the prime minister was forced to resign. His Sayukai successor, a general, lost no time in rolling back the tide of liberalism. Within a year, he'd used the Public Security Preservation Law to arrest thousands of known and suspected communists across Japan, and planned for a more aggressive interventionist stance in China. It was a new era, quite literally, because the next year, a new emperor, Hirohito, came to the throne, beginning the Showa period, and radicals in the Imperial Japanese Army would start taking matters into their own hands.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of increasing radicalism, nationalism, government force we are seeing in this video is pretty similar to a lot of the stuff we were seeing throughout Europe at this point, you know, particularly in Germany and Italy. The same sort of trends were showing up, so it's not necessarily surprising. I suppose we'll see how it's all going to play out. I suspect not well. But yeah, so that was an interesting episode. If you guys enjoyed, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more. You know, if you have other videos you want me to react to, leave them in the comments below and I'll check them out. Yeah, so hope you guys like this one. I enjoyed the episode, and stay tuned for part 3. I will see you guys again next time. Goodbye.